A device like this can cost something like $40, but the files it plays cost nothing to copy. The format behind the file carried a price that can't be printed on the receipt. Somewhere between the portable player and the car stereo faceplate that reads MP3, a licensing bill existed. It never showed up in a download dialog or a media library window, but the companies making those products saw it clearly. Patent filings, royalty invoices, and compliance paperwork. The people pressing play were never part of the conversation. That's what this is all about, the gap between what listeners experience and what a manufacturer pays. MP3 emerged from audio research in the late 1980s, when engineers were working on perceptual coding and found that digital audio files could be compressed dramatically by discarding sounds that human ears couldn't really hear anyway. One of the lead engineers tested his algorithm against the same a cappella vocal recording roughly 3,000 times, tuning and tweaking the codec until a bare human voice with nothing else in the mix to hide behind survived compression without having audible damage. The result was a codec, basically the method of encoding and decoding audio, that could shrink an audio file to roughly a tenth of its original size and still have it sound good. A 4-minute track that would take up roughly 40 megabytes on a CD now fit inside 3 or 4 megabytes on a hard drive. That ratio mattered because the constraints were severe. A portable player in the late 1990s might carry 32 megabytes of flash memory, so something like 8 compressed songs or less than 1 uncompressed track. Storage was expensive, and back then internet connections were slow. A desktop optical drive tray could rip a jewel case CD into a folder of compressed files, and suddenly an entire album could occupy the space of a single uncompressed track. Software manuals even printed RIP to MP3 as a feature and firmware update CDs shipped with, which had this MP3 codec support built in. The format solved a practical engineering problem, and it very much seemed like it was here to stay. Portable players arrived in the late 1990s. Those typically silver devices with the blue-black lit LCDs and click-wheel controls took MP3 and turned it from a desktop convenience into an object you could carry anywhere with you. You could use USB cable to plug them into your computer and transfer all your songs, and then just listen at your leisure, or even use it in your car. The MP3 badge on the product box worked like a trust mark that let you know you could play your music there. No need to carry CDs or buy anything extra. It was good for retail because it reduced purchase risk at the shelf and made a compression standard that was easily visible. Behind every one of these products sat an encoder or a decoder software component that compressed or decompressed audio using the MP3 method. Building an encoder means writing code that implements patented techniques, and a decoder is virtually the same. So any company shipping a commercial product that created or played MP3 files needed rights to use those techniques. We know the story by now. That need is what licensing pressure is. When a format becomes popular, every company in the supply chain faces a decision about whether to pay for the right to support it, which then inevitably leads to implementation cost, the expense a manufacturer absorbs to include a patented format. And it was showing up everywhere. A chipset maker designing an audio decoder for portable players paid licensing fees. So did a software company shipping a music encoder or jukebox application, and these paid per copy or per unit. A device manufacturer stamping MP3 on product packaging paid for branding rights. Back then, the per unit royalty on a decoder was about 75 cents, which sounds very cheap. In fact, it was small enough to vanish inside a product's retail price. But then you think about how many units could be sold. We're definitely talking about millions and millions of dollars. Royalty invoice layouts, licensing agreement cover pages, and legal memo headers circulated through procurement departments worldwide. The toll was not even a single toll. 2 separate licensing programs operated at once, one administered by the format's original developers, one by an independent patent pool representing additional rights holders. So, a manufacturer building a device capable of playing MP3 often needed agreements with both programs before shipping. Patent document printouts circulated in legal reviews, and software EULAs reference codec patents in dense paragraphs. Small hardware startups that fabricated a $10 player had the same dual compliance burden as a major electronics firm building a flagship device. The licensing layer did not scale to company size, just to implementation, which was a problem for many. But consumers would never notice any of this. The licensing terms said so explicitly. Private, non-commercial use required no license at all, meaning you could listen to your MP3 song as many times as you wanted. The cost applied only to companies shipping commercial products, neatly included in a retail price of a portable player box, a car stereo unit, or a desktop media application. This only lived in quarterly royalty invoices and licensing agreements, something that moved between legal departments and patent administrators, all upstream and invisible. The format functioned like a tax embedded so deep in the supply chain that only the builders knew it was there. And that gap between a published standard and a freely usable one is where the royalty lived. Standards committee paperwork defined what MP3 was, while patent holders defined what it cost to ship. A format could be well documented, widely understood, and technically open to study, but it would still carry tolls at every point of commercial implementation. Being standardized and being free to build around were separate conditions entirely. Luckily for some, by the mid-2000s, alternatives existed. Some offered better compression or operated under royalty-free models. You could find audio codec compression charts in trade magazine spreads, laying out the technical differences, but none of it overcame the installed base. MP3 had already been pressed onto flash memory, stamped onto faceplates, wired into firmware, and stored on spindles of burned CDs, so it was hard or impossible to compete. A car stereo would ignore the alternative format. An existing library of thousands of files would need a conversion and compatibility assumptions that were built over a decade, or it would break. The switching cost was not technical, it was infrastructural. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. A format that plays everywhere gets used everywhere, and a format used everywhere forces manufacturers to support it. Bitrate presets and encoding menus and file extensions and media library thumbnails all assumed MP3 as the baseline. It all happened too fast, and by the time the licensing cost became a question anyone thought to raise, the format was already too intertwined into the ecosystem to walk away from. The file sharing explosion came. Napster first, then every network that followed. And all it did was accelerate this without changing its structure. Every compressed audio file that moved across the network reinforced MP3 as the common language of digital music, from hard drives to burned CDs to media tracks, and then, most importantly, file sharing. And still, every device and application that played those shared files required rights to decode them commercially. But everything must come to an end. The formal licensing program for MP3's core patents ended in 2017, after the relevant patents expired. The toll gates closed, but files kept playing. The players, the car stereos, the software libraries, the chipsets, the entire material ecosystem that MP3 had shaped over 2 decades remained in place. The format had already done its work on pricing, on product design, on which alternatives gained ground and which ones stalled. So the patent's ending did not reverse the infrastructure it had built. Even when headlines announced the format's death, the format kept playing. Just no one was paying fees anymore.